here. So we've got words. Zooko is popping on now. We'll be pinning him on the Zoom in a second. He actually sent an email in saying that he was very much enjoying the conversation and wanted us to keep going. So thank you for the time, Zooko. But let's just keep discussion going. I think the way that we were all putting our hands up, asking very important questions, let's just keep doing that. So maybe, yeah, Zooko, hands up first. You're first to go.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Yes.
All right. I can't see the audience, but I really enjoyed listening. Really great conversation. Really briefly, I want to sort of introduce myself. I don't know as much about this as most of you. But one thing that I have to bring is that I've been one of the many founders of Zcash for 8 years now. And so I have some experiences from that. By the way, I can't figure out how to put my hand down, so pretend I'm not holding up my hand. Thanks. So I have some practical experience from seeing some related things being used in the wild. Yeah, that's what I have to offer. Thanks for Professor Matsuo for inviting me.
Oh, great. Sorry, I was just trying to open up the great. Hi, Zooko. I didn't realize you were online this entire time. So you would have heard a lot of discussion was around sort of the privacy and compliance, right? So I guess I want to kick it off with what are your thoughts? So I think one of the key questions we got was around, having these privacy pools and these association sets. It actually introduces potential centralized points, right? Meaning these providers who are effectively providing, generating these association sets, and they could be a centralized point or points of failure, but also they have to be trusted to be a good actor. So, what are your thoughts around that, right? Around that aspect of introducing more trusted parties, and second question is around that is how do we ensure that they themselves comply, that they are good actors?
Well, that's a good question. I don't. Let me just tell you my instinctive response, which is so the privacy pools technology is a very interesting and elegant technology. One thing I find really interesting about it is that it's kind of a generalization of something that already exists and is already deployed in Zcash. Zcash currently has a sort of narrow kind of privacy pool style membership disclosure that you can do, I guess. And one of the main things I wanted to point out from my practical sort of industrial experience is that not only the regulators, but also the CEXs are very far from even understanding or even trying to use that. So there's a lot of learning curve yet to climb, in my view. But to your question about those centralized actors that are generating the association sets, I have a very strong overriding concern about the way the privacy pools technology was introduced to the world as a solution to OFAC sanctions against protocols. And that's where my head goes when you ask about those actors who are responsible for generating the sets, because in the OFAC use case, there's this one actor who's generating the sets, which is OFAC itself, right? But also, more importantly to me, sort of the elephant in the room, is that cooperation is mandatory under pain of punishment, like imprisonment. And that's actually an even bigger kind of centralization in a way, right? So my very strong concern was that I thought it was wrong to pitch that technology as a solution to that sort of coercion-based, like criminal process, because in the context of criminal process, the principle of innocent until proven guilty is super important because of the non-voluntary nature of the participants' engagement, and because we have this principle in like liberal democracies that it's more important to protect the innocent from false imprisonment than it is to prevent some of the crimes, right? Those are fundamental principles of I'm not a lawyer or a historian, but those are fundamental principles in my book. And so it really bothers me that it was introduced in sort of the popular, like the initial abstract and newspaper article or whatever articles as being a solution in that use case, where I think that's wrong because it violates that principle of innocent until proven guilty. But also where I think we're very, very far. Maybe someone here has more insight than me, maybe Jemma, but from my experiences with regulators, many different regulators, and with the CEXs like Coinbase and Gemini and Binance and so forth, they're very, very far from even understanding or even beginning to engage with this kind of protocol. But on the other hand, I can imagine, and your presentation, Jemma, included lots of motivating examples in which we're not talking about the force of law, which should be constrained by these really strong principles against its abuse, but instead we're talking about more decentralized and voluntary like situations in which people could engage. Well, I guess that shows I don't really have an answer to your question. I think your question points in the right direction, which is this kind of protocol can be used by more or less centralized and more or less voluntary or coercive social relationships. But I don't have a good answer. Maybe I could give some insight from my experiences with talking to centralized exchanges and regulators about Zcash. It was a good question. Look, I'm sorry. I think somebody in the audience to answer.
I'm not sure if anyone actually has an answer. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, you asked me the impossible question first thing.
So I also don't have an answer, but I did write down a couple questions around the associated sets and the privacy pools that I think could steer this in an interesting way. Firstly, could you prescribe association sets to being risk rules? So then you almost have this layered approach where there's a plethora of pools, and all of these pools are almost like a layered threshold-based system where the user chooses to nominate if they would like to be part of X set, Y set, and Z set. And say, for example, Z is the most compliant. It is like the money is known. It's almost like getting close to that the one that you were saying, where the association is actually direct with the deposit for the withdrawal. So that was one question. Is it possible for association sets to be actually prescribed risk rules? And then can we start discussing those rules with organizations like FATF, and that actually builds the guidelines. So then these pools become more widely used by centralized exchanges and sort of providers. Like Zooko was saying, it's kind of impossible for them to develop this technology right now on their own because they've got, of course, their own interests, and it doesn't really align. Secondly, if I am kicked out of all these association sets for being a bad actor, does that in theory mean that my funds are forever trapped, or what happens there?
I think on that first one, definitely possible. I think that's probably the premise. I mean, eventually how association sets will be constructed for different purposes will be based on a set of rules, right? I think the question is really around what rules is what are the limitations of these rules, and more importantly, like if these funds will end up have to be off ramped into dollars, then with the regulators, like what do they think about these rules, right? To your second point about the funds are there forever trapped. In fact, that's one question we always get in our dark pool is, a good actor enters a pool as a good actor and then becomes a bad actor. What happens to the funds? We think that they should be able to withdraw into the same wallet. So it's almost like they have a fixed amount of time, say X months, that they can withdraw into the same wallet that they deposited in, and that's it, right? So they have a way out and they can get money back, but they can't withdraw into a new wallet, right? So it's almost like you can get a refund, but after X month, if you haven't touched it, then probably goes to like a black hole or some sort of contract. But yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on that too, Zooko.
Well, I have a half-baked thought. It reminds me of, at some point, someone pointed out to me that the centralized exchanges are the dominant privacy solution in crypto. And that
Yes,
sort of
I've heard that.
opened my eyes. I was like, oh, that's right. Everyone deposits to Coinbase or Gemini or Kraken or Binance. And one of the benefits they get out of that is that when they withdraw from there, their source of funds is mixed with all the other customers. So when you were asking, when the speaker, who I can't see, was suggesting that it might be useful to have multiple like tiers of compliance, it reminded me of how, like in my view, I hope this isn't offending anyone from Binance out there, but in my view, if your funds are getting withdrawn from Gemini, that's more likely to be well KYC'd and well reviewed than if they're getting withdrawn from Binance, right? So I kind of thought, oh, that's kind of like the multi-tier system that we have today. And then my next thought was, and Binance is way, way, way bigger than Gemini. There's a lot more customers using Binance for a lot more money. So maybe the less stringently monitored tiers are bigger, which I guess it makes sense.
Great. So we have a question in the audience.
Zooko, I didn't understand the innocent before guilty kind of chain of thought there, because I mean, like regulators are just going to form their own views about, you know, what addresses are good and bad, and these association sets are a kind of a way for them to express their view and integrate that view into this transfer process. So could you kind of elaborate, kind of expand on that, why you're calling that innocent and guilty?
Yeah, with the caveat that this is my personal moral convictions, and it's up to Jemma to redirect the conversation to other things if she doesn't want to hear too much of it. But like again, it's not the protocol, but it's the way it was pitched as a solution to OFAC, and in that context, it is it's the concept of proofs of innocence, right? It is a protocol which was proposed as a way that innocent users can prove their innocence to the law. And that is fundamentally a concept that I think is contrary to good law and to the classical liberal tradition of government. You don't prove your innocence to the law. Instead, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt through a process. Does that make sense? Is why I found it objectionable?
But is that
Not even now.
is that a just following up on that? I mean, the proof of innocence is, you know, was proposed as a technical solution, right? So is it coming down to the fact that technically that is where our limitations are, and that's the best solution, and therefore we call this a proof of innocence, even though, you know, as you say, it's sort of against this liberal democracy, right? That is sort of this notion of assume innocence until proven guilty. So it's really a technical solution that the limitation is not the law here, but the technical constraint.
Okay, so let me jump in for a second, because I'm pretty sure me and Jim's heads are exploding right now. So yeah, Zooko, sorry, you can't see us in the room. My name's Amanda Wick. I'm a former DOJ prosecutor. So part of the, and I was at FinCEN for a short time, and I'm sitting next to somebody from FinCEN. So who used to be at FinCEN. Part of the issue is people throw around the term innocence and guilt, but the criminal justice system is very different than the regulatory system. And it's really important to remember that in the United States, the innocent until proven guilty part really applies to deprivation of liberty, right? Like you're going to put somebody in jail. That's why sanctions as a program isn't innocence or guilt. It's a regulatory program that prevents hopefully the flow of funds before something happens. Like that's a lot of regulation, right? We want to prevent something before the bad things happen. Innocence and guilt and imprisonment is after you've done something bad. It's a completely different burden, completely different standard. Having said that, I will say your point, if you don't mind me slightly rephrasing it, is I think there are
Please.
many people inside of the United States, many lawyers inside of the United States, many people outside of the United States who fundamentally object to the arbitrariness with which they feel sanctions are applied, and that the sanctions program in itself lacks a sufficient amount of investigation and due process. So a lot of the objections, if I'm hearing you right, is just an objection to how the United States is applying sanctions. And if you disagree with the sanctions program, then the idea of doing all of this work and doing all of these technical solutions to a program that many people feel is being applied arbitrarily or unfairly seems like a not good use of time. Is that a fair recharacterization or like a fair summary of what you were saying in a sense?
That's not a bad position, but you corrected me on a very important specific point, which is that principle that I'm holding so dear is about deprivation of liberty, not about regulation. I totally agree. That's really critical, important point. My personal objection is not with the administration or the national strategy regarding sanctions or something like that. It's more just about principles and sort of what I envision as long-range consequences of technology. So let me go back to that. I really agree with you that in our sort of well-regulated governmental system, there are much stronger limits on what the government can do when it's potentially depriving a potentially innocent person of liberty than when it's limiting some other like market functions or something like that. But I want to argue to you that the advancement of the digitalization of life and the integration of society is actually blurring that boundary because people are now dependent on both economic and communication infrastructure for their life, right? You could have a situation which we've seen sort of like ugly foreshadowing in the United States, in which someone is deprived of the ability to earn, the ability to buy things, the ability to get gas, the ability to communicate, not by due process, but by a telecoms company or PayPal or something else. And that seems to be likely to get worse as people are more and more dependent on this kind of infrastructure, and as the infrastructure has gained more and more information, so it's able to make finer grained monitoring and finer grained interventions into people's lives. One more thing before I let you respond. The infamous Chinese model is obviously, I hope, to you, a bad one that we don't want to emulate, but it's the direction that the underlying technology takes us unless we have privacy and decentralization built in. Does that make sense?
It does. I think the only place where I would disagree, and I know Jim probably has lots of thoughts, but I think the place that I disagree is that there are places where you want privacy, and then there's places where after 9/11 we're never going to get, right? So several years ago, I remember I was at a conference and Jerry Brito was speaking, and I don't know if he's from Coin Center. It's a think tank in the United States for some folks in the room. And basically he was kind of advocating for, I'll say something similar just because it's easier for time. And I said to him, you can't possibly be advocating for the anonymous free flow of money post 9/11, because that will never happen. And I think my concern is sometimes that I think a lot of former gov people absolutely understand the need for privacy. And frankly, I know some former prosecutors who are defending people who are being unfairly hit with sanctions. So it's not like this is like a clear thing. I think it's very nuanced. But I do think it's a real problem when people say, well, we want privacy, and the answer is anonymity. Because at the end of the day, law enforcement, and especially, but regulators too, if somebody does something bad, there has to be a who. Like if you eliminate the who and you say you can never find out who this is, that technology, I think is a non-starter. I think given where we're at in history, like where we're at now, with regards to terrorist financing, I just don't think you're ever going to be able to successfully make the argument that there should be anonymity in transactions. I think you can get privacy. I think it's when you say, well, we want to take all of the transactions and make them anonymous to the world, including law enforcement and regulators. And I think that's when you lose. I think that's a very difficult argument to make. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it's a great argument. You said two things. You mean both that we as a society, or you and me, don't want that, and that the government will never let it happen. You mean one or the other, or both of those? Oh wait, you got to get the mic back. I got to hear more from you.
It's a great question.
Sorry, say that one more time, Zooko. The two things.
Well, I interpreted what you were saying as two possible meanings, and maybe you meant both. One is that, in your opinion, we as a society don't want a world in which people can spend money and there is no possible recourse for the government to uncover what they've done if it has sufficient need. You don't want that. And the other is that since post 9/11, the government will never allow that to happen. So if there's a technology that enables that, then it's never going to take off.
Yeah.
Are you arguing one or the other, or both?
No, I think it's the latter. I would never say that everybody wants that, because I think I've met enough libertarians who are okay with terrorist financing, who are like, look, terrorists gonna terrorize. And that I can't argue with the libertarian stance that they think, and this is not all libertarians, just there are.
But I asked what you want. I asked if you're speaking to your values about that.
Oh, well, I mean, I was a prosecutor for nearly a decade, and I think humans are by default pretty horrible. And if we don't have regulations and enforcement, humans gonna horror. I mean, like that's my personal viewpoint. I don't know how relevant that is, but yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very nihilistic. But I say all that to say that I don't know that everybody agrees with that. Some people are really optimistic, but I think the point being that, like, with enough terrorist attacks, unfortunately, like, it really doesn't matter what people want. People start dying. There's terror, like the reality post 9/11, post Patriot Act, it's very difficult to undo that. Do I see a world in which de-dollarization happens, sanctions evasions happens, basically US policy stops dictating the world, and then all of a sudden, like, we're further away from that? Maybe. But like right now in the world that we live in, it's very difficult to imagine a place in which the argument for the anonymous free flow of money is remotely possible. It's just hard to imagine unwinding FATF and years and years and years of at least saying out loud, we want to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing.
Jim.
Amanda said it much more eloquently than I could, but the point I wanted to make was a simple one, that the world we're in now, if you want to open a bank or a brokerage account, you're already presumed guilty until proven innocent. You basically have to prove your identity and prove that you're not on various sanctions lists. But I think one big takeaway for me from this is that privacy is not a binary 0-1 variable, that it's really a question of control over who has what information and what can they do with it, and that there is a continuum of different possible outputs. And I think that is sort of a thing that we're not, with the exception of a few diehard extremists, I don't think anybody would say, nobody should ever know anything, or everybody should know everything. It's really who knows what, when, and where. And that's, from a policy perspective, that's what I think we need to be working on.
Oh, well, that's a great point. The part of it that I think is the most important, which Jemma touched on during her presentation, is who chooses whether information about a person is disclosed and to whom. So to me, there's a pretty stark gap between consensual, in which the person in question chooses to disclose, which Jemma mentioned some such protocols, and Zcash has such a protocol in which the users can voluntarily disclose things about themselves, versus if it's non-consensual, it's very different, both in terms of political philosophy, as we discussed, but also to Jim's question about what is the process for that decision to be made if it's not the end user's unilateral consent. But anyway, I'm trying to agree with you and say yes, and yes, in addition to who knows what, who learns what information. Also, what I think is really critical is who decides when the information gets disclosed to whom.
Just on that point, Zooko, I'd be curious to understand, you said in Zcash, and I must confess, right, I haven't looked at Zcash for a while. What's the, if a user wants to reveal information about him or herself, how would they do that, right? And on the flip side is, if a regulator comes to Zcash and goes, I want to know, these transactions are suspicious. I want to know the flow and also the individual behind it. Like, how does that work?
I'll happily tell you about the cryptography protocol part of it, which I think is cool because I'm, a computer scientist and cryptographer by background. But I should point out, since I'm trying to offer you lessons learned from my 6 years or 8 years, whatever, of experience in the field here, nobody's ever used the cryptographic protocol for anything. What happens in practice is the centralized exchange does enhanced due diligence, where they send you an email requesting PDFs of stuff to disclose where you got your funds and stuff like that. So that's one of my points, is there's a big gap between theory and practice here. But to answer your question, Jemma, there's this cryptographic protocol built into Zcash called incoming viewing keys, in which you are the end user who possesses the secrets associated with a single self-hosted wallet can disclose a secret to a third party, which lets that third party see all of the information that wallet sees with regard to transactions that flow through that wallet. So in theory, that's almost getting close to a kind of privacy pool. So you could imagine, you could say, show me all the you just deposited into my bank or exchange. Well, you have to reveal to me all of the transactions throughout all history or throughout the last 30 days or whatever, so that I can be sure you haven't received any incoming transactions of whatever amount since a recent hack. Right? That would be pretty close to what we're talking about. Let me tell you some facts about Binance. This is public, so hopefully they won't be mad at me. And anyway, I'm not their customer, so I guess it doesn't matter if they're mad at me. But Binance has requested from the Zcash community. They said they've got a problem with customers depositing Zcash into Binance from the Zcash shielded pool. Now, if you don't know, the Zcash shielded pool is the original zero knowledge proofs-based shielded pool. So there's the zero knowledge is about how much information a third-party external observer can get about the source of the funds, right? So they've said publicly or semi-publicly to the Zcash community, we don't like people being able to deposit into their Binance account out of the Zcash shielded pool. I presume, they haven't said this, but I presume that's because they like to use chain analysis tools, which operate on transparent addresses instead. Okay, sorry, I got to explain. Zcash also has transparent addresses. So it's got the shielded pool, just sort of akin to Tornado Cash, but better. And it's got the transparent addresses. And so Binance has been saying, we would like it if we could constrain our customers to only deposit from transparent addresses into their Binance account, not deposit from the shielded pool into their Binance account. And one thing I think is really interesting about this is they're not asking for or talking about or using the viewing keys feature that allows this cryptographic disclosure to them, but not to the public, of the entire history. Instead, they're asking for something which is less information for them. But my point is, I don't think they understand, the people who are asking for this from Binance don't even understand about the existence of viewing keys, is my suspicion.
And I think that's a very good point, that we can have all these technology built in to allow third parties, right, whether using viewing keys or multi-sigs to access information and link up wallets with the users. But ultimately, sounds like end of the day, the third parties themselves either don't understand the tech behind it, or aren't equipped to maybe use the technology, so that and just end up still, it sounds like quite a analog process of emails and PDFs, right? That,
Yeah, that's what I think.
and I think that's
Yeah, so there's a long
where-
like education process if we want any parties to use or to regulate well or anything on this stuff.
But
And
I
let me
think-
add another example is Gemini. I love Gemini. Like I said earlier, I think they're the most sort of regulatory foot forward among centralized exchanges that I know of. And you can deposit into your Gemini account from the Zcash shielded pool. And uniquely for Gemini, they will also let you withdraw your money from Gemini directly into the Zcash shielded pool. But they just do a whole lot of like enhanced due diligence and KYC and all that stuff. That's their approach. But again, they're not taking advantage of any of the more sophisticated protocols. It's sort of only the first couple of parts of what the technology offers have yet been actually like adopted and exercised and practiced, at least among the parties that I've been interacting with.
And I think this gap between what the technology can do and how it's already been built to do versus what the people, the third parties, whether it be exchange or regulators, want to see or their understanding, I think that gap is probably sort of a blocker, right? To use a developer term, is a blocker to actually sort of progressing from a regulatory stance, progressing more quickly, because they simply don't understand what or don't have that, or understand some but not all, and therefore still sort of feels quite constrained by a technology that appear to have a lot of the stuff already built. It's just no one uses it.
Yeah, let me say something, and then you, maybe Amanda and Jim or others can reply. Oh wait, there's a great levitating thumbs down on the screen. That's cool. Hope that's not for me saying something else. What I was going to say is that in the criminal indictment against the Tornado Cash founders, it's included the fact that they deployed what they called a AML tool or something like that, but they deployed a thing which, as you described earlier, Jemma, required compliant, like voluntary action on the part of the individual to disclose their history, or namely to disclose the mapping between their input and their output from the Tornado Cash pool, right? So there's another like concrete example from history. So that was intended to be or labeled as being a compliance tool by the Tornado Cash founders. But not only did OFAC not start using it and requesting people's mappings from their Tornado Cash transactions, but they even included its existence in the indictment as further evidence of the developer's guilt. Like that they built a compliance tool, and that compliance tool did not require KYC information from all the Tornado Cash users was included in the indictment as reasons why these people should be tried. So that's a really big gap, and maybe other people here who have more experience and knowledge about law enforcement or OFAC specifically could comment. But I'm telling you, not only are they not using, in this particular case, is OFAC or Treasury not trying to take advantage of this particular tool, but they actually included the existence of the tool in a criminal indictment against that person. That's a huge gap. So, okay, here's my actual question. Privacy pools, of which you are an expert, Jemma, has anyone talked to the Treasury Department about the privacy pools idea? And can you tell us what they think of it?
Sorry. So as I was at FinCEN. Zuko, it's good to see you. It was great to see you on Global Encryption Day on the Hill. And my question was not was not meant about Tornado Cash, but I was at the National Security Council when we took the sanctions action, not the DOJ action. So I'm afraid I can't offer insights that aren't publicly available on that particular action, except that like I do feel that that OFAC's position is that it was the entity Tornado Cash and not specifically the protocol that was designated. So which lends some very interesting policy questions about entityhood and personhood. I know that I think in DeFi are some really interesting areas for further discussion. So hear you. Apologies that I'm going to pivot away from that.
Okay.
Then. And I'm so sorry, I'd been raised my hand before, so I'm sure others here may have comments on Tornado Cash. But I really appreciate the points that you've made around privacy. I, of course, coming from FinCEN, feel that generally the process for determining what information gets disclosed to whom typically comes via like law and statute that's passed by Congress, and things like IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act in the U.S. and the Bank Secrecy Act, the two really big authorities for countering illicit finance. They are very broad and very powerful tools, which does mean that there's a lot of discretion and authority that those agencies have. FinCEN typically doing them through notice and comment. OFAC not being bound to notice and comment to the public for their sanctions designations. So there are processes there. Anyway, okay, and then now onto the actual question that I had. So I also really appreciated a point that you made about discoverability from telecommunications providers compared to like PayPal's, and that points to some of the interesting nuance of this space, where now the same rails support financial activity and non-financial activity, which traditionally had been bifurcated. And we have very different privacy frameworks and expectations on financial rails and activities versus non-financial activities. And so I guess I was curious if Zooko, you or Jemma or others have thoughts about the ability of technology, like as more and more non-financial activity gets supported on blockchain platforms. And so much right now has been focused on financial use cases, but really the interesting stuff comes on the non-financial stuff, right? Or I think so. And I'm curious, like how and if you feel that some of these capabilities, can they be honed to be able to detect certain conditions when like what's happening is financial versus not financial, and then whatever the criterion and agreed upon process is for level of discoverability for financial versus non-financial can be imposed on different transactions and activities. Because I feel like that has to be the future if you're going to have the commingling of financial and non-financial activity. Otherwise, you're going to lend to not enough discoverability for on financial stuff, or way too much access potentially for authorities to information activity. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the state of tech or policy. How would you propose approaching, either with devs or with gov, approaching a space where now the same underlying general purpose tech can support financial transactions and data transactions?
Zooko, do you want to give us a go first?
I don't immediately know of promising ways to separate those out again. What I've seen is they've been merging. And it looks like to me that the fundamental technology tends to make them merge more and more. You can definitely separate them out by centralized monitoring and control, right? Like you can disclose all of everyone's network protocol usage to some third party, which uses some process to evaluate whether what they're doing with it counts as economic or social. And that's basically what we have done to some degree with like telecoms providers until now, I think. My feeling about the cryptography and the blockchain protocols and the network protocols is that not only does it make it harder for someone to discriminate between those two types of use if they want to, but it also actually blurs the line and unifies them. The example I'm thinking of is that in Zcash, again, every financial transaction, so Zcash is like Bitcoin, it just does financial transactions like Bitcoin does, but every such transaction also comes with an end-to-end encrypted message. So the original idea was you can use this for a metadata associated with your payment. So the recipient knows what this payment is for. Also, the original idea was we could conceivably use it to comply with the travel rule. If you're sending a transaction of the right type, you could include the senders and receivers KYC information in the accompanying metadata. But my point is, nowadays, notes and chit chat and social media updates and whatever. If you look at the other way, it's a messaging system, and every message comes with a payment, but the payment could be like a Satoshi or whatever. It could be minimal. So in this case, the economic and the social have merged into the same protocol.
I don't really have. I think what Zooko described was a very good sort of combination, right, of messaging and financial transactions. To be honest, I don't really have much more thought on that, except I guess with, the most obvious non-financial transaction that happens could be like around gaming, right? You trading gaming assets. But then, selling like CS skins as a non-gamer, right? Like I know that selling CS skins is very profitable as well. So that effectively then sort of becomes a financial transaction if the assets, these in-game assets are very profitable, right? And can potentially be used as intermediary to even launder money, right? So I think it's for me, I think that it's a very fine line between what is financial and what is non-financial, and probably from regulators' perspective, probably assumes that it's going to be all financial until proven non-financial. I don't know. I think
that's a good question originally. Thanks.
Oh. Sorry, what was that, Zuko?
I was just saying that's a really good question
Mm.
about being able to treat those two types of human interaction under different rules. It's a good question.
Yep. Excellent. I think, Joey, are we time or one more? No, we're over time. Okay, we're over time. Sorry. I think we'll then wrap it up now, and we can continue the discussion offline. Great.
Thank you so much,
thanks
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuko. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Let's see. Okay. All good? Okay.
All right.